The American election of 2020 was dogged by accusations of a rigged democratic system. Before the election, Democrats warned that their base had to vote before they lost the right to do so. Afterwards, Republicans bayed at the outcome that had been stolen from Donald Trump. The cruel irony was that the American democracy had already been proved a sham 20 years earlier. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the No One Is Competent podcast, where we prove that not only everyone that's ever been in charge, but every institution that's ever been in charge is terrible at doing everything they intend to do. My name is Azalea, and I'm once again joined by my main man. How we doing, Jay?
Doing all right, yeah. A bit busier this week than usual, but otherwise I'm all right.
For the audience, a bit busy means that we were working on this podcast like right up to recording it.
Well, you know, it's our podcast is of course
man.
entirely unscripted, so you know, it's not very difficult to do.
Yeah, no, we know all this stuff,
all memory.
And we just tell it to people.
You don't have to look stuff up.
And then you send me your audio, I sync it up, and we just ship it exactly as we recorded it with barely any editing at all.
And the listeners, it's their duty to just listen to it as is and do not look up anything or fact check anything, because
it's
not your job.
The only thing you should look up is going to my Twitter at Azalea Wyatt so you can see how pretty of a person I am. That's the only thing we want you to do. Well, I guess you could check out the podcast Twitter at not_competent. You could email us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. We've gotten some very nice emails. If you ever want to ask us any podcast questions or talk to us about some incompetence you've seen in the real world, that's where you could do it. Also, podcast suggestions. We love those. We love those so much that this is actually the very first podcast suggested episode. I want to give a big shout out to my man Buggy. He is a guy who kind of helped get me into the podcasting gig. A little bit of behind the scenes lore. About a year ago, I actually recorded my first and to this day longest podcast with my man Bug, and he has been a lovely enjoyer and person I talked to about the podcast. He's given me some advice, kind of helped steer us a little bit, and this episode was suggested by him. So if you're listening, Bug, we love you. And actually, wait, hold up, Jay, will we have met without Buggy? I feel like he connected us.
Yeah, it was through his server, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, if I hadn't responded to him enough times on Twitter to get invited to a Discord server, this never would have happened.
He is the podcasting senpai.
Anime Twitter, officially a good and beneficial thing to exist on planet Earth. That's the definitive statement. We're not going to investigate it any way further. Anime Twitter has had a net positive in my life, and therefore everyone else's lives, because I am the most important thing on planet Earth. Jay, you have any problems with that statement?
No, not really.
All right. So, what are we talking about today?
We're talking about a certain presidential election that was not the 2021, as we've already talked a little bit about that, but rather the one that was 2 decades prior, everybody's favorite, the 2000 presidential election.
Yes, we are talking about George W. Bush versus I don't know his middle initial, Gore.
That's why he lost. He didn't have a middle initial.
Harry Truman, is Harry S. Truman just so he could have, a middle initial?
I mean, sure. I believe it.
I've heard a story that, both his grandfathers had a name that started with S, and they couldn't agree which one to name him after, so they just named him Harry S. Truman.
I feel like
I don't even know if I buy that.
I feel like if you want to be president, or if you want to kill the president, having an initial really improves your chances.
It does. It really does. My middle name is Thomas. Well, my government middle name is and I think it's pretty ass. I actually will probably legally change it soon. Fun fact, because I don't give a fuck. My legal name is Wyatt Thomas Holder, which means my initials are literally WTH.
That's pretty good.
Which my parents did insist they did not think about when naming me, which is frankly a fucking shame. Like, the fact that they didn't calculate that. I just, like, I lose all faith in them. I have met a William Thomas Fowler before, so that's nice.
Yeah, it's powerful abbreviation.
So we should probably start with talking about the decade that sets up this election. We're going to talk about the political vibe of America in the 90s.
Yeah. Now, the 90s were long enough ago that most of our listeners are likely to have no significant memories of the decade. I mean, I'd even imagine that a fair few of you might not have even been alive during it. Now, I was around during the 90s, but I was young enough to have no real memories of those years. Certainly not old enough at the time to be aware of things like politics, and as such, my knowledge of the decade is pretty much completely secondhand. Now, looking at it from a 21st century perspective, the character of politics during the 90s can come off as a bit weird. It's sort of like the uncanny valley phenomena. There are enough similarities between the 90s politics and those of today for it to be pretty familiar, but just enough differences that it feels a little bit off.
I agree. The 90s are effing bizarre. Like, everyone strikes me as always being very happy when people talk about the 90s, or like depictions of the 90s as like this super like peppy time in America. My dad talks about it like it was the roaring 20s. But the inverse of that is that, like, when this election is going on, like, culturally, this is like the peak of like the angry white boy era of music. Like, life was so great for white people in the 90s, and yet like all of the music from like ICP, you'll have Eminem in a few years, like you have Kid Rock, this is when he is like a significant figure, Limp Bizkit. It is just like Detroit rage from one end of the political spectrum to the other. Like, the young people are fucking pissed. And I don't know. I find that juxtaposition to be kind of hilarious. But this is, a time when the economy is moving very quickly and America is looking very dominant. You've got the end of the Cold War and a strong economy fueled by the rapidly growing technology sector. The Soviet Union was gone by December of 1991, and a few years later, people began logging on to the World Wide Web. From 1994 to 2000, the GDP growth averaged around 4%, with millions of new jobs being created every year. The deficit shrank before transforming into a surplus, which is like kind of the only time in American history that has happened. Am I wrong?
I don't know off the top of my head.
A few years during the 90s?
It's pretty unusual.
I know if you look at the line, it's like fucking weird. It's like down, 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 and there's like 3 years in the 90s where it's like, oh, we were in a surplus. While not everyone benefited from this boom, it meant those who did, especially white middle-class Americans, could ignore the increasing economic inequality that stratified the nation. Now, a lot of conservatives like to say that the economic power of the 90s was all down to just, like, the effects of Reagan trickle-down economics. This is completely effing ridiculous. Like, we had just invented the internet, the most important thing to happen to the human race since the printing press, or arguably the wheel. Like, that was going to cause economic growth.
Yeah.
It is not complicated.
Yeah. The media landscape of the 90s was already beginning to take on a highly polarized status that we're familiar with today. 24/7 news channels and talk radio programs rose up to rival newspapers and nightly news for prominence. The 90s is when Rush Limbaugh will become really popular nationwide. Fox News will launch in 96, MSNBC will launch in 96. And these old and new news sources did have a lot to discuss, with issues such as crime, gun control, domestic terrorism, and the handling of incidents such as the sieges of Ruby Ridge and Waco all cropping up, as well as a certain sex scandal we'll be mentioning shortly.
Yeah, you had the LI uprisings in the 90s. You had the trial of O.J. Simpson. You had Columbine.
Yeah,
It was a scary time. It was like a time of general, like, it kind of reminds me of, like, the mid-teens-ish, where, like, the economy's moving relatively fast, and then just every once in a while, like, America would be horrified by, like, this insane tragedy or government malfeasance.
Yeah, I mean, Oklahoma City bombing was in the 90s. The Trade Center bombing was 93. So yeah, like, you have bad things that, in hindsight, I think are kind of forgotten because the 90s got remembered as, economy was doing great, everybody was happy. And
this sort of bygone golden age. I have no doubt that in the next 5 years, like, we're already starting to like, the nostalgia cycle is going to fully kick in as the 90s become properly 30 years away, and, like, we're gonna have tons of TV shows and movies set in the 90s that are like, look at this simpler, happier time. That is 100% going to happen.
Yeah. And, the latter half of the 90s also saw the internet beginning to have an impact on popular discourse, though a pretty small one. The conservative news aggregator Drudge Report launched in 1995 and is an early example of the politicization of the internet.
It's in this context we can look at the Republican and Democrat parties as they were in the 90s. Bill Clinton was elected president in 92 after defeating the incumbent George H.W. Bush with a large majority in the Electoral College, though not a full majority of the popular vote, if I remember correctly. While 92 was a stunning defeat for the GOP, the party would not stay down for long. The Republicans already began to shift to the right on social issues with Goldwater back in the 90s, and this shift was entrenched in the 80s under Reagan. While by 2020 standards, the 90s GOP might seem outwardly civilized, this appearance is mostly due to how adept the party had become at using racial dog whistles to push their arguments. The quote-unquote far right had taken over much of the party by 1994, when the party under Newt Gingrich... I have no idea how a man named Newt Gingrich got any political power, but Newt Gingrich gained control over the House of Representatives for the first time. This is the first time the Republicans captured the House of Representatives since 1952. And I want to freeform here for a bit, just to sort of make this point about political radicalization. The 90s would start a trend in America of, like, elections being, like, significantly close regularly, or at least you not having, like, the old landslides, like the elections like 72, 84 in America were just like complete massive blowouts.
Yeah.
Whereas even like we talk about, say, the election of 2008 in the 21st century being a landslide election, but McCain still won a bunch of states.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, like the idea now that like New York and Mississippi would vote for the same candidate, like to people who their entire political, history and entire political knowledge comes from 2000 onwards, is unthinkable. But that happens all the time during the 20th century.
Yeah, like Reagan especially was an incredibly popular president. Nixon had won almost every state. And this is because in the 20th century, the political parties were not what we call politically polarized, which means, and this is going to sound pretty nutty, but there were lots of liberals in the Republican Party in the mid 20th century. Fun fact, Jackie Robinson, the famous black baseball player, was an outspoken Republican and liked being so, and like protested Barry Goldwater's candidacy.
Yeah.
And you had, as we'll get into, tons of conservatives in the Democrat Party. The 90s are this kind of switch point when the parties begin to what we call ideologically sort, where the conservatives are all going to go to the Republicans and the liberals are all going to go to the Democrats. That process won't like really completely solidify until Obama, but the 90s is when it starts happening and can be measured in American politics.
Yeah, for sure.
So yeah, the Republicans are growing more radical in this time. Not like much more radical, but they're starting to be more aggressive. Newt Gingrich has taken over the House of Representatives, and, he will shut down the government, which actually went terribly for him. But we're kind of seeing a more fight tooth and nail GOP that looks a lot more like the one that exists now than before. And the Democrats, on the other hand, are in power. Things should be going great for them.
Yeah, while they were starting to struggle in Congress, Clinton certainly didn't make things for the GOP easy. As the Republicans lurched to the right, the Democrats had followed. The poor performance of the party in the presidential elections of 1980, 84, and 88 were blamed on seemingly stale progressive branding, and as a result, Bill Clinton embraced what was called the third way politics, which can generally be viewed as a combination of kind of mild left-wing social policies, or at least messaging, with right-wing economics. Clinton's centrism, combined with his personal charisma and the strong economy, led to a convincing re-election in 1996 and generally high approval ratings. Clinton quickly gave up his attempts at left-wing reforms, such as the universal health care bill, and came to the table with policies that Republicans could get behind. While not the inventor of the war on drugs, Clinton ramped it up further, and the crime bills passed under his watch were perhaps responsible for the fact that America now has the largest prison population in the world. That's another, big thing with Clinton, was the law and order. And that's something which he campaigned on a lot and talked about a lot. And law and order it doesn't have to be, but in practice it is often one of those racial dog whistles that the Republicans have started using a little bit earlier.
Yeah, and that was the strength of Clinton. You have to remember, he broke 12 years of Republican presidential rule. And there was only Carter in a brief interregnum before that, with a very lame presidency. Clinton figured out the meta and started beating the Republicans at their own game of the tough on crime years. And while he may have preferred to, in his heart, rule much more liberally or even progressively, looking at him from a modern lens, he certainly looks like a conservative, at least when you look at what his presidency accomplished and what happened under him. And then, everything would, that would all get thrown out as unimportant because we got a sex scandal to talk about. To keep things short, as this isn't an episode about the Clinton administration, Monica Lewinsky was a White House employee whom Clinton had an affair with. Lewinsky confided in her friend about this affair, who ended up recording everything secretly and giving her up to the FBI as part of an ongoing investigation into the Clinton administration. I would love to talk about how, I was listening to a podcast about the Clinton administration the other day, and I was kind of reflecting how, when we did our QAnon episode, we talked about how conspiracy sort of built inside of American culture. And I don't think we really fully emphasize how the 90s were a big catalyst of that. you basically had Republicans insisting throughout the entirety of the Clinton administration that there basically had to be something shady going on, Clinton body count and all that. And, you had Whitewater, you had one of their close confidants tragically committing suicide. There was a bit of smoke, and this eventually got a whole investigation started, which mostly rooted around some pretty baseless and bloodless, just, the casual corruption that frankly everyone in power in America does. But then they got their teeth on Monica Lewinsky, and the FBI locks a woman in a room for 16 hours with zero regard for her constitutional rights, because that's the job of the FBI, and just bullies her into confessing everything. And, this would go, and Bill Clinton would lie and say he didn't do it, and then he would get impeached over it. And then he is acquitted in the Senate because at this point, as is always, we actually talked about this in our last episode, funny enough, impeachment is always a pure political, one party against another affair. It's worth noting that in the 90s, Bill Clinton was actually considered a bit of a feminist and a very libertine figure, and was almost completely forgiven by the media at the time. You guys should look up what Jay Leno or say Larry King or who's the Tonight Show or Today Show guy.
I don't know.
Anyway, they're not important, but look up a late night host talking about the Monica Lewinsky Bill Clinton sex scandal at the time, and you will see just some absolutely disgusting derogations of a 24-year-old woman who did not sign up to be a part of the national conversation. Just absolutely degenerate comments and sketches and jokes and whatnot. But it didn't really sour Clinton as much as one would think.
Yeah, and I've seen old Saturday Night Live, skits about Clinton, and he's portrayed as this kind of smarmy, womanizer who's kind of goofy, but somebody who you can't hate, somebody who's it's just Bill Clinton, he's Bill Clinton. That's just who he is. It's a part of him.
It is bizarre because when I hear the name Clinton, I think of Hillary Clinton, right? I grew up, and Jay, you mostly grew up in the era when Hillary Clinton was a much more important figure. But people do kind of talk about Clinton very much the way people talk about, say, Trump or Obama, as a guy who had and Bush, as a guy who had a very consistent, and Bernie Sanders. There's an idea. He had a personality aura around him that was very distinct, and that a lot of people liked.
Yeah. And,
at least that's the vibe I get.
Yeah. Not to stay on this point, or on Bill Clinton for too long, but, there are, I believe, multiple allegations of rape and or just sexual harassment on this part, and I'm inclined to believe them based off of this entire guy's history.
Yeah, and when you tell the story of Clinton's presidency, and that Al Gore loses the 2000 election, spoiler alert, it's easy to say, oh, well, the economy was going great, but then Clinton had this sex scandal, and this sort of sours the Democratic Party. But this is, does not seem to really be true. As we said, the impeachment went straight down party lines. A lot of conservatives were outraged, but it's not like the conservatives liked Clinton beforehand. most Americans really seem to shrug their shoulders at the whole thing, and there are many reports that Clinton's approval rating towards the end of the presidency were as high as 60%. So this was an incredibly winnable election for Gore. But let's get into the election proper, and it's time to meet our fighters! In the red corner, weighing in at yada yada, I don't know how fat this weird Texan is pounds, we have George W. Bush!
Yeah. Now, George W. Bush was the son of, the former president George H.W. Bush, the guy Clinton defeated in '92, and the grandson of Senator/banker Prescott Bush. Now, the Bushes were the scions of an old, the old school Rockefeller wing of the GOP that had flourished in New England. These are prep kids, all getting funneled through the Ivy League universities, and they tend to emphasize economics over social issues within the Republican Party. These kinds of people pitch themselves as the smartest people in the room, and they're pious but reasonable and can manage the economy well. In reality, they go wherever the wind is blowing on social issues and let corporations loot whatever isn't nailed down in once in office.
You can tell I wrote this part because it has a lot more opinions in it, but I always love when Jay has to read the stuff that I wrote.
Yeah. Now, Mitt Romney is kind of the last gasp of this ideology on the national stage, but it's still somewhat potent in New England. You can definitely tell that you wrote this next part. H.W. Bush spent a while playing the Virgin to Ronald Reagan's Chad, but eventually achieved the presidency after a long career in government and business, and George would grow up in his father's shadow.
George drank his way through college at Yale, where he was in the same secret societies and whatnot his father was part of. He's the classic adrift fail son, but eventually he cleans up his act, he kicks alcoholism, and he gets married relatively young. Bush's daddy gets him a job in the Texas oil industry, which makes him independently wealthy. He buys a baseball team and cultivated an accent that made him feel like a far more authentically Texan than his father.
Yeah, and on a few notes about that, his actual job in the oil industry, he starts an oil company, exploratory company, and it fails pretty miserably. But it gets bought by another company, and he kind of just fails upwards into being on the board of that company, and that company fails and gets bought again, and he fails upwards because these companies keep him around on the board because he's Bush.
Yeah, HW was also an oil man before he went into fully working for the CIA. You can, if you study Bush Jr.'s life closely, over and over again, between him getting admitted to Yale and him one company fails, daddy makes a call, that company gets bought, that company fails, daddy makes a call, that company gets bought.
He was probably
W. Bush is the fail son in American politics. He is the fail son.
Yeah,
it is. Maybe Don Jr. will top him, but Don Jr.'s existence is already so sad and punished. I kind of doubt it. It's a beautiful thing to study. Y'all really should look into it sometime, and maybe we'll do a whole podcast about it one day.
Yeah, he was probably guilty of insider trading in the third company, but doesn't go anywhere because he's Bush. And he actually ran first for Congress in 1978 against, in one of the Texas, one of their congressional districts. His opponent was a Democrat, Kent Hance. Hance defeated Bush quite easily, and the way Hance did it was by portraying Bush as kind of a rich, out-of-touch, New Englander. And I remember...
Because he was.
Yeah, I remember watching a documentary about George W. Bush with my parents a long time ago. And it's not a great documentary. It was mostly a puff piece. But they were interviewing W, and he had a line in it which has stuck with me. And W said that I lost because Hance, out good old boyed me. And I vowed then and there in politics to never be out good old boyed again. And like, to me, if there's any like core to Bush's politics, and like, you know, people kind of view him later on as just like a puppet of Dick Cheney or whatever, or kind of an idiot. But I think like, you know, if he's truthful about that, I think he is.
He chose to be that way.
That is like, he was very good at creating that character for himself. And, you know, we'll see later on how, you know, powerful that could be.
Yeah, and to vibe a little bit off of you, like, my dad always calls George Bush the C student president. And, like, you know, it kind of reminds me of how when you become a content creator, when you become a, like, say, a podcaster or a YouTuber, I've done this for years, you're often, like one of the advices you get is to, like, you know, some people just straight up play a character and are completely different in their persona. But that's hard and can be exhausting and can cause a lot of weird personal side effects. Generally, the best thing to do is to be a more exaggerated version of yourself. Is take sort of the personality features that you already have and crank those up instead of trying to create an entirely new persona. And I can really see Bush doing that. Like, you know, he always enjoyed sports and whatnot. He always was good with people. He was a party guy. He's obviously very personally likable. He was never the smartest guy in the room. And he sort of intentionally exaggerated that a little bit. Again, some portrayals are confused. Most portray him just as a dunce. You can sometimes argue that, you know, it was all an act. I don't really think it was all an act. More is that, you know, it was a role he was really good at playing. And, you know, George Bush is a guy who we will do podcast episodes in the future about him just, like, unleashing an absolutely obscene amount of genocidal horror on the world with the War on Terror and just destroying human rights at home. And to me, the most terrifying thing that George Bush ever did was the "Now watch this drive" clip. You know, Jay, where he like is talking to the press on the golf course and like is talking about bombings in Afghanistan. Is like, now watch me hit this golf shot. Because the most horrifying thing about George W. Bush is when you strip away like all of the war crimes, all of the destructions of civil rights, all of the machine politics, the utter wreckage of America and his own party that he left in the wake of his presidency, he was, at his core, a dude. He's just a guy. Not a particularly smart guy, not the dumbest of dumb guys. He's just a guy.
Yeah.
And a guy can unleash all he unleashed. And that is the scariest thing about him.
Yeah. And, you know, being, you know, just a guy, he had to do something to kind of elevate himself a little bit further. And basically what that would end up being would be running for the governor of Texas. You know, his dad would kind of bully him into doing something important with his life. So Bush ran for the governor while his brother Jeb ran for the governor of Florida. Remember that for later. Now, Bush won the election easily with unified support of the party and perhaps a little skullduggery by his operative Karl Rove, and who'd end up being highly popular in office and enjoyed a higher support amongst Latinos in the state than one might expect from a Republican. He cut taxes and oversaw education reform that was considered successful at the time, but is now proven to be ineffective.
Bush distinguished himself from his father by actually having a working personality. His simple nature and love of sports made him easy to talk to, and while the man was nervous and neurotic in private, he projected an air of casual, confident likability in public. He seemed like the kind of guy you could barbecue with. You know, Bush leaned heavily into his Christian religion while in office. He declared one day of the year Jesus Day in Texas, and he'd often speak openly about his faith. You know, it was understood throughout this time that, like, you know, every politician more or less is a Christian, especially in the GOP. But Like, they didn't always talk about it. Bush talked about it. He made it part of his brand. And this allowed him to win the loyalty of religious conservatives without invoking the harsher realities of, say, homosexual oppression and misogyny. That was all understood. Like keeping the gays and the women down. Like that was understood, but it was unemphasized in, say, the way that the GOP is now, as, like, Texas becomes a fascist state of controlling people's bodies and putting trans folk on lists. And this older style of emphasis on religion and keeping things more casual, Bush's brand, this was called compassionate conservatism, which does mean nothing, but that is what they called it. When Bush entered the election in 2000, he would run on lower taxes and education reform, but he was far more of a personality politician than a platform politician. And facing him in the blue corner would be Al Gore.
Now, Gore also comes from political aristocracy, if not quite royalty. His father was a senator from Tennessee and graduated from Harvard because a significant amount of American history is pretty much just a proxy war between Yale and Harvard. I've actually heard that, like, his father also, like, put a lot of pressure on Al Gore, like, basically saying, like, you will be the president one day. I don't know how true that is, but it would certainly kind of make some things make sense.
Helped stamp him into the robot he became.
Yeah. Now, unlike Bush's casual stint in the Air National Guard, Gore actually went to war in Vietnam, though seems to have seen little combat. I mean, that's not too unnormal, you know. The majority of people involved in Vietnam are, like, most other American wars, and by people I mean American troops, like, aren't actually getting in gunfights on the regular.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's not a knock. I just couldn't find any
Yeah.
evidence of him, like, getting in a battle when I was researching this. But he did serve in Nam.
Yeah. Gore briefly worked as a journalist before getting his House seat at the age of 28, fulfilling his destiny as a born and bred career politician. He upgraded to the Senate in 1984, where he was as careful and moderate as one would expect from a Democrat in Tennessee. He would sit on the Science and Technology and Energy and Commerce committees and was known for his passion for investigating climate change, which developed into a general reputation for being a straight-up nerd. The Science and Technology thing is where he gets, the whole, like, Al Gore invented the internet kind of meme, because, like, that committee was involved in funding predecessors of the internet, and that kind of spiraled from there. To the point where mocking Al Gore for claiming to have invented the internet, like, was a thing during the election of 2000. Like, that's not just a modern thing.
None of our target Zoomer audience knows the Al Gore invented the internet meme. We already insulted the significant amount of 60-year-olds who listen to this podcast at the top when we said, well, none of y'all remember the 90s, and now we're, like, telling people to remember, like, this joke from 2004. Moving on. Gore came in third in the 1988 presidential primary, and while his campaign didn't flame out as badly as, say, Joe Biden, he was by far outshined and spent most of his time sabotaging Jesse Jackson, which isn't true, but it's fun to say, so I'll say it. Gore was picked to run with Clinton in 92, despite concerns that he was a Southerner, same as Clinton.
Yeah, this decision was a surprise to most observers, as traditionally Democrat candidates had picked a vice president who represented some sort of different appeal to themselves.
That is what Gore would actually do 8 years later, interestingly enough.
Yeah, like, more progressive candidates tended to pick more moderate vice presidents and vice versa, and they would also generally go for ones from different geographic areas. This is why you have JFK, a New Englander, going with Lyndon B. Johnson, a Texan. Clinton and Gore, on the other hand, were both white Southern moderates.
which is probably why they got along, unlike JFK and LBJ, who famously could not stand each other.
Yeah. Now, Clinton had a few different things in mind when picking Gore. The two men were 44 and 45 respectively, making this the youngest major presidential ticket in US history. And this youth was seen as a strong contrast to their older opponents, those being H.W. Bush and Ross Perot, who we probably won't be talking about much, but there is a guy named Ross Perot who's kind of a populist and will actually get a decent amount of the votes, like in the in 92.
Despite being named Ross Perot.
Yeah. Clinton's campaign also believed that they could make serious inroads in the South, and doubling down with another Southern Democrat would help them defeat the Republicans in that area.
Yeah, like Massachusetts, it's like, well, who are you going to vote for, honestly? But pivoting to the South was a pretty smart idea, and it's almost like Democrats should keep doing that instead of nominating people from fucking California.
Yeah, and finally, Clinton believed that having uniformity of messaging was more important than having differences and potentially disagreements between the candidates.
As vice president, Gore was the nerd to Clinton's jock, often handling the subjects Clinton had little interest in, such as climate change, the internet, and a few lesser foreign policy concerns. While many sources characterize Gore as close to the president, and it seems they were personal friends, many note that Clinton often chose the counsel of his wife over the vice president. We have to reiterate that Gore was not known as a people person. Doing quote-unquote research for this episode, I just casually asked a bunch of older people that I knew, like, what the 90s were like and what Gore's vibe was, and, like, across the board, like, nerd, dweeb, like, numbers guy, this is what came up. His brand emphasized personal competency and knowledge over him being likable or relatable. Gore was seen not only as a continuation of Clinton policy, but as a representative of college-educated professionals and liberals over more blue-collar Americans. Gore would select Joe Lieberman as his running mate to pull his ticket a little bit more conservative, and his platform emphasized the economic growth of the current administration and promised more balanced budgets and quote-unquote fiscal responsibility. He differentiated himself from Bush by his slightly more generous stance on gay rights and his promise to defend Medicare from conservative privatization.
Now, of course, these candidates had to go through the primary system, which I imagine most of our listeners are probably familiar with, but basically you have to go through primaries to be selected as the candidate for your party. But in this case, the Republican and Democrat primaries for the 2000 election are notable mostly just for how decisive they were. Bush and Gore crushed their main opponents. Bush won 44 states and territories to John McCain's 7.
Loser.
While Gore swept all 56 contests undefeated, the only time a non-incumbent has achieved that feat since the modern primary system began.
Yeah, and that was because, like, Clinton fully backed Gore, and it was just, he was more or less shoved through. There was never any question.
Yeah. These primaries would serve mostly just to introduce the two candidates to the American people, or at least those who were not already familiar with them.
So as we roll into the race proper, it was clear just about everyone that Bush and Gore would be the two candidates before the primaries ended, so head-to-head polling became important early on in the year. From February through June, Bush had a clear, if not massive, lead, averaging a 6-point lead over his opponent, which I know in the wake of the 2020 election that polling has kind of become called into question as to how effective or accurate it is, but polls were generally more accurate these days, and also 6 points is, it probably says something. That means percentage points, by the way. So if, say, I'm at 37% and Jay is at 31%, I have a 6-point lead over him. By late August, however, things had begun to change. Gore crept upwards in the polling even and even ahead in most polls by early September. Bush would regain the lead by a few points in October, which he would maintain going into Election Day. The point being, it's quite close. The final New York Times CBS poll before the election had Bush at 46% and Gore at 41%. Notable too for the results was the third-party candidates, namely Ralph Nader, who was at 5%. More crucial, however, was the state-by-state polling. Remember, we're on the Electoral College system, so states are what matter. According to the New York Times on November the 6th, the map is something of a jumble. It shows that either candidate is within reach of assembling the 270 electoral votes needed to win. Another characteristic of the 2000 election was a lack of any single dominant issue. You know, we think of 2016 as being like a Hillary's emails, an immigration election. 2020 was more or less a referendum on Trump and COVID, but this is a lot more muddled.
Yeah. Quoting from The Role of Issues in the 2000 Presidential Election, which is an article by Arthur H. Miller and Thomas Klobuchar of the University of Iowa, between 1992 and 2000, the concerns of the public shifted from economic to domestic issues. Despite perceptions of prosperity, Gore could not capitalize on the economic improvements that occurred under the Clinton-Gore administration. Similarly, George Bush was not able to take advantage of the moral issue based on claims of growing distrust in government arising from the scandals in the Clinton-Gore administration. With no single burning issue facing the electorate, broader enduring issues carried more sway in the election outcome. Bush gained an advantage on issues such as defense spending, investing Social Security funds in the stock market, and the role of government in assistance to minorities. Gore was advantaged.
Can you imagine if he had done that?
Yeah.
Like if Bush had done that and then like his presidency. Oh Lord.
Yeah. Gore was advantaged by issues dealing with spending on government services and women's rights. Gore was slightly advantaged by the issues, but the public was almost evenly divided on those most relevant to vote choice, helping to explain why the election turned out so close. Yeah, people kind of forget that, Bush did well with minorities.
Or at least much better than, one might expect him to, given the way the modern GOP works.
For sure.
Which, I mean, this is the thing that Democrats and people who follow, people who identify as Democrats rather than just vote for them forget, is that a lot of people of color are temperamentally conservative, always, because a lot of the human race is temperamentally conservative. I don't know. I don't know if I want to get into... Alright, fine, fuck it. There's so many fucking college-educated white people who do this weird form of racism where, they love to just autistically fucking think of politics as these binary yes-no Republican Democrat systems. So if you are black, you vote Democrat. If you are gay, you vote Democrat. If you're a woman, of course you should vote Democrat. What are you thinking? And just completely take away the fact that a human being could have agency or preference or I don't know, believe in something.
Yeah. I mean, if we're talking, for example, about immigrants from Latin America, a lot of Latin American countries have conservative governments, which are supported by conservatives. So, the idea that these people would,
the help of,
magically...
the CIA.
Yeah. Yeah. So, the idea that, people from these countries who then move to the U.S. will become, magically liberal for the rest of their existence due to, their ethnicity or DNA or something. Yeah, it's not true.
And this is also an era when, the GOP has not moved full into border hawkery, right? One of the great failures of the Bush administration and the Obama administration was, there was a broad consensus in this time in politics that we needed to reform the border to let a lot more people in and to allow quote unquote illegal immigrants a path to citizenship and to actually take care of this shit instead of But, they were never competent enough to do it. They always, just kick the can and kick the can. But, this was not the caravan is coming era of GOP politics.
No.
And another thing that we'll kind of come back to again and again is, as we see on the issues, this was not an election that, was shall we say, a decision between red and blue. This is a decision between two shades of purple. I think a lot of the electorate kind of didn't particularly see a massive difference in these candidates. And it seems that both campaigns ironically made the same error, overestimating the impact of the Monica Lewinsky scandal and other Clinton administration scandals had on the public view of the Clinton administration. Bush ran on, quote, restoring honor and dignity to the White House, while Gore distanced himself from the president, the two becoming I always forget how to pronounce this word. Infamously estranged over the course of the year. Clinton rarely appeared in campaign against Gore and was sent to rallies in mostly safe Democratic areas. Gore did not utilize much of Clinton's campaign staff, the staff that had won the previous two elections. Instead, he went with his own people, many of whom were seen as opponents of Clinton. Gore's VP pick, Connecticut Senator Joe Lieberman, was seen as an attempt by Gore to distance himself from Clinton, as Lieberman had been very publicly critical of Clinton's personal failings in the Monica Lewinsky scandal.
Yeah, and with the American people fairly divided on the issues, the personalities of the two candidates would ultimately come to be a major deciding factor in the campaign. Bush, as we mentioned earlier, was very effective at having this sort of image of himself as a friendly, approachable figure, the kind of guy you'd want to hang out with. Gore kind of switched track and wanted to come off as more passionate about the issues. And, in part, he would actually adopt a more vocally progressive and somewhat populist tone to the campaign.
He's kind of where the phrase bleeding heart liberal comes from,
Yeah.
if you remember that whole thing.
Yeah. But, with his, awkward personality, this ended up coming off more as aggressive or aloof. I was reading about reception to the presidential debates, and a lot of people apparently back then, viewed Gore as having quote unquote won the first debate, but by the third one, people thought he was being too mean or too aggressive. Well, Bush was nice.
People in the 2000s are so cute. They're so fucking adorable.
Now, Gore could have maybe compensated for his lack of, charisma by having Clinton around. But, as we mentioned, he didn't want Clinton around. Even though Clinton had a high approval rating, again, it was in the low 60s even by the end of 2000. But
which is more than Joe Biden will ever be able to dream of.
Yeah.
Even if things go great for him.
Yeah, but none of this advantage rubbed off on Gore.
I want to back up a bit because we know that Bush is going to win the election, so we keep kind of talking about the things that he did right rather than the things that Gore did wrong. To reiterate, thing y'all might not know, Gore won the popular vote. It was very close, as we'll get into, but more Americans wanted him than Gore.
Yeah.
An amount of people, double the amount of folks who live in my hometown, wanted Gore over Clinton. Wanted Gore over Bush. This was not a case of the entire country being bedazzled by Bush's charms or whatnot. The Democrats were popular, Clinton was popular, and despite all of his best efforts, that did carry Gore through a lot of votes.
Yeah.
And the reason that he didn't win is, of course, because of the Electoral College. Now, most of y'all are probably familiar with this. After the 2016-2020 elections, the President of America is elected not by that popular vote, but by a group of individuals known as the Electoral College. It is actual people, despite the fact that we almost never know their names, because, doesn't help. The like if you claim like if your belief is that America is ruled by a shadowy cabal, the Electoral College does not help disprove that claim. It's composed of electors from all 50 states and the District of Columbia. States are afforded a number of electors equal to their representation in Congress, their number of senators, plus their number of representatives, leading famously to a total of 538 electors. A majority, which comes out to 270 electors, is needed to become president. Now remember, that's states and D.C. So, if you live in Puerto Rico, in Guam, in any of the American territories, you do not get to vote for president because you are a second-class citizen, because America is not a democracy. But that is a rant for another day.
Now, as predicted by the pre-election polling, the state-by-state results on the night of November 7th, 2000, pointed towards an election that would be won by very slim margins. Clinton's victories in 92 and 96 were decisive in part thanks to his success in the South, with his campaign winning Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee both elections, Georgia in 92, and Florida in 96. In comparison, Bush comfortably carried most of the South, as well as the rural Midwestern and Western states. Gore, meanwhile, carried most of the Northeast, the West Coast, and the more urbanized Midwest. This is like one of the first maps which looks like what you probably think of when you think of an American presidential election map today. You don't have all those blue states in the South as we had with Clinton.
Yeah, all the reds in the middle in the South, all the blues on the sides.
Yeah. These two coalitions ended up balancing each other very closely. Towards the end of election night, it was clear that Bush had won at least 246 electoral votes, while Gore was at 250. Wisconsin, Oregon, and Florida remained very close. And as Florida's 25 votes would be enough to decide the election for either candidate, the state ended up being the focal point of the election.
Florida, Florida, this is all gonna come down to everybody's favorite state, the state of Florida. Hot take, everyone likes shit on Florida, and when you go overseas and you meet a person, say from in Europe or in Asia or whatever, and you're like, you been to the U.S.? And you're like, oh, I've been to Florida, and you'll go, don't judge us by people in Florida. Everyone is a fucking coward who is embarrassed of Florida and all their Florida manery. But let me say, if we lacked Florida, we would be such a less interesting union. All right? They got the swamp, they got the gators, they got the meth. Frankly, everything I want America to be, you can find it in Florida. And everything I am terrified of, you can also find in Florida. Like wine moms and old people. So,
I feel like it's like, if you kill the giant rat, another rat just becomes big and takes its place. I think people are like, oh, we should kick Florida out of the U.S. If we did so, just some other state would just turn into Florida. I don't know which one, but there has to be a Florida in the United States.
We down here in Georgia would certainly try. Now, see, at first, it didn't seem like Florida would be so contentious. Pause for a second. A lot of this confusion comes from just the general desire that Americans have to know the result of the election right fucking now. This is part of this, the 90s have occurred. The 24-hour news cycle is now fully entrenched in the ADD minds of America, and they need to know who is going to win the election at 9 p.m. EST. That is what is expected. That is what is demanded. And around 7:50 Eastern Standard Time on the election night, the state was called by NBC for Gore, and most other networks followed suit. A few hours later, however, CNN retracted their call, prompting the other networks to do the same, after Bush began to make up significant ground on Gore in the counting. you got to remember, the way they're doing this is people are physically and electronically counting ballots, and like the people will make projections. So even like, let's say me and Jay had an election between us, and a bunch of y'all voted, and like if they've only counted 25% of the vote, but of that count, Jay has like 87%, and I have only 13%. Like, statistically, you can say, yeah, it looks like Jay's gonna win. And because, you know, you're in this ratings war, and the people desire a result, and you want to give them the result, you say, oh, looks like it's all going to Gore, we'll give it to Gore. But then, you know, things can change, especially as you start to count districts that have significantly different populations, especially in a state like Florida, which is way more diverse and interesting than, say, fucking Massachusetts.
Yeah. And
I don't know why I'm getting worked up, but I am.
Yeah, like this election is the reason why a lot of these news agencies would revise the way they, because, you know, they still do this to this day, and they will still call the states with like 2% of the vote in. You know, it's not like this ever stopped, but they had to revise their algorithm, so to speak, to avoid this embarrassment. And, you know, in 2020, that would be another contentious issue with states being called. And like, I think you can make a fair argument that Arizona was probably called a little bit early. It ended up being the correct call, and they were kind of spared having egg on their face. But like,
well, not that it mattered.
yeah, not that it quite mattered, but like, you know, that's why in 2020, you know, all these agencies were very like consistent in talking about how like rigorous their standards were, because they didn't want a repeat of 2000.
Yeah, and like, you know, I am a very neurotic ADHD diagnosed, hopefully soon to be medicated for it person. Like, I lived in Georgia when like the race was not called until like Friday. And yes, it was nerve-wracking, but frankly, in an ideal world, I actually feel like that's how elections would go, and you wouldn't know any results until they were all counted, because all votes should be treated equally by the system.
Yeah.
You know, at least if you know, claim to enjoy liberalism, which, So, around 2 a.m. on the morning after the election, the networks called the state for Bush, but this too would be retracted a few hours hence, as votes that favored Gore were counted, and the clown show continues. The final result had Bush up by just 1,784 votes, a slim enough margin to trigger an automatic recount. And Gore decided against conceding the election, instead waiting for the results of the recount. Was he, like, going to, like...
I think, like...
what wasn't there...
Yeah.
Didn't he, like, kind of concede, and then, like... I mean, a huge problem about this is we're going to get into is because Gore failed to control the conversation, but, like...
Yeah, like, he had, like, conceded, and then like members of his team were like, no, don't, and they, you know, pushed for a recount, which, you know, you had like automatic recount, which was in 4 counties. And it was like, you know, let's wait to see what happens. So like, he didn't fully concede.
Yeah. One of the lessons we're going to get into here, one of the things I fundamentally believe, maybe Jay has a different belief, is that a lot of this world is ruled by thugs, and that thuggery is a huge part of determining who's in power. And will to power is an important thing to have if you want to be a successful politician. Knowing the world in your head that you want to exist, and then reaching out and declaring the world so. That's a huge part of, for instance, Donald Trump's power. And, like, Gore was a lot less willing to do that.
Yeah, Bush's team had a lot more will.
Yeah, he instead of staying the course and like going down with the ship, kind of ends up being wishy-washy, which is not going to help him in public opinion.
No. Now, the recount in Florida was complicated by a series of factors, perhaps most infamous of which would be the design of the ballots themselves. Several counties had adopted a punch card style of ballot, in which a voter would vote for a candidate by punching out a section of paper, a chad, next to the candidates' names.
The hanging chads! Sorry, I'm just quoting my dad at this point.
Yeah. In several cases, however, the punched out section would fail to completely detach from the ballot, preventing it from being read by the automatic counting machines. These so-called hanging chads resulted in ballots that had to be inspected and counted individually. Hand recounts were requested in 4 counties. Complicating things further was a statement by the Florida Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, that all counties would have to turn in their revised totals by November 14th, or those revisions would be void.
So they're not giving them a lot of time to recount,
No.
and counting takes a long time.
Yeah, Harris rather conveniently was also the co-chair of Bush's campaign in the state. And the governor just so happened to be a certain Jeb Bush. There's certainly no conflict of interest there.
Yeah, so what we have going on here is the first result says that Bush won. So if they count again, that result might change. So the Republicans are directly incentivized to not let them count again, or to rush or interfere with that count.
Yeah. Now, the Florida Supreme Court at this point would actually step in for the first time and extend the deadline to the 26th of November, upon which a new count resulted in Bush having a lead of just 537 votes.
And this count was not without fuckery. One of the things I wanted to investigate going into this, because I had heard about it, was the so-called Brooks Brothers riot. This is something that happened when, on November the 22nd, there was a recount happening in Miami-Dade County. And you've got this government office where the recount is being held, and suddenly dozens of protesters are gathering in front of the office. And while you might assume these are concerned citizens who just want the vote stopped because they think it's dumb, in reality, this crowd is made up almost entirely of Republican operatives and people those Republicans have paid. Famously including people from the Brooks Brothers law firm, I believe. And what makes this whole thing even more suspicious is that one of the guys in this crowd is a motherfucker by the name of Roger Stone. Jay, have you ever heard of Roger Stone?
I have, yes.
Roger Stone is... he's... as evil as he is, I'm kind of glad he exists, because he is a person who makes living on planet Earth a little more interesting. Roger Stone is a longtime Republican operative, like Nixon administration Watergate longtime operative. He's a skilled campaigner, helping presidents like Reagan and Trump get elected, but would then pivot to lobbying work when his boys were in office. So he's interested in winning rather than ruling. Roger Stone excelled in what he himself called dirty tricks, using media manipulation to smear his opponents. And while he's certainly experienced, it's hard to tell just how effective he is, as much of his reputation comes from his own self-hype. If you see an interview with Stone, he really likes to play up his own power and how much of a Batman villain he is. One of the best documentaries and things covering him is this Netflix documentary, Get Me Roger Stone, which is very fun and kind of does showcase just how much he's been involved, but involves lots and lots and lots of footage of the man himself talking, and kind of builds him up as this super villain puppet master genius guy, which he isn't necessarily. And while he's a minor player in this story, Stone is a character we do encourage you to look into. Some highlights: he helped invent the modern concept of lobbying. Like lobbying. He's behind that. and would help invent the Political Action Committee, the PAC, Super PAC. Ever heard anyone talk about that? Yeah, him and his friend Paul Manafort, they helped create that. And while there's a special place in hell reserved for him, he may get his own episode one day. I occasionally think about it. So, Roger Stone and these other GOP operatives, they physically force their way into this building, injury, beating, striking. It's described as trampling several people in the process, and they physically stopped government workers from counting the ballots that could have hypothetically contained Gore's victory. And we mention this because it's often spoken in the more conspiratorial parts of the left. And, some will even claim this is the day when the election was stolen by the GOP because they stopped the count with violence. And while it is fucking bonkers that no one, got charged or investigated for this, and, that in a major city, people just, broke in and stopped the count, there is no way to prove that this, sealed the election or this determined one thing or another. It's possible it did, but the same possibility stands for many, many different events that we've, if, one or two more hanging chads had gone a different way, or, the Supreme Court stuff we're going to get into. It demonstrates how shoddy and borderline illegitimate the Florida counting process is. And, I could go on a whole rant here about how a lot of the ways we do elections around the country is pretty dumb. I mean, one only has to look at, say, I don't know, the 2020 Democratic primary in Iowa to see how much local officials can screw up an election. But I don't really have a way to end this. Jay, what were we talking about? I've been riffing too long, and now I've spun myself into a void of riffing. I am adrift. Please anchor me, Jay. Please rescue me.
To I guess push you further adrift by talking about Stone for even more. I think what's interesting about 2000 in general is a lot of the parallels with 2020. I think you also see with the Brooke brothers, right? The template of what would eventually lead to the Capitol siege, where it's this idea of if you have what is, on the grand scheme of things, ultimately a relatively
the government
small...
is made of people, and if you physically stop those people from doing their job, you stop them.
Yeah, and if you have a relatively small but energetic amount of preferably white people who you can sort of
and big people who are willing to push their way in.
Yeah, then you can use them to apply pressure on the government in certain ways, and
physical pressure
without any real fear of prosecution or repercussions, because again they're white, so they're not going to immediately get mowed down by the police.
And they are also very well paid lawyers, so they're not going to get in much trouble afterwards.
Yeah. Now, all that being said, the limited recount had shrunk Bush's margin, though Bush was still ahead. But this was the fact that it was now less than 600 votes meant that Gore's campaign could call for a statewide recount. This call was turned down by one of the state courts before that decision was itself overturned by the Florida Supreme Court, which officially called for a statewide recount, which would affect about 70,000 votes, on December 8th.
Yeah, so the state court representing the people of Florida says the people of Florida deserve a recount.
Yeah.
But then the Bush committee would appeal that decision to the good old Supreme Court. Something that I am just letting y'all know, once we can figure out how to do it in less than 3 hours, there will be an episode on.
Yeah, that kind of shows what you mentioned earlier. It's obviously impossible to say what would have happened if the situation was the same but reversed. If,
Gore was ahead.
Yeah. If Gore was ahead and, Bush was the one who had called for a recount and everything. We don't know exactly what would have happened, but I feel Gore, especially as individual, would not have been so energetic in immediately taking it to the Supreme Court. Even if we pretend that like the Supreme Court would have like a liberal majority in this hypothetical scenario.
What utterly wiles me up, like what utterly just baffles my brain, is that Gore is not in Florida this entire time throwing rallies and marches and shit. Like, you gotta remember, we're now a full month after the election, and, you know, it's very understandable that the American people are at this point, like, really frustrated and confused because this process is taking way longer than it should and that they were promised.
Yeah, like, to add to, like, the confusion, like, and kind of, you had mentioned it earlier, but I didn't remember the exact details, but, like, Gore had actually called Bush to concede the election, you know, the day after the election. And then, like, Gore later publicly retracted that. But that kind of shows, like, Gore's mentality where he wasn't fully in the fight. A lot of the people in his team were, but I don't think he quite was there.
And part of the reason that this is not seen as the scandal that it should be seen as is that the American people don't care about this because Gore told them not to care.
Yeah.
But on to the Supreme Court. One of the three federal branches of government, it's the judicial next to the executive and legislative. The president is the executive branch, Congress is the legislative, and Supreme Court, the judicial. The Supreme Court, however, has a much less defined role in the Constitution than most people probably imagine. As an example, the Constitution does not define the size of the court, nor does it give the court the power of judicial review, the ability to overturn legislation that it sees as constitutional. The court straight up just took that power because, again, the world is ruled by thugs who just choose to reach out and grab shit. And in practice, the nature of the Supreme Court means that a body of 9 judges appointed for life, which is not something that happens in the entire rest of the U.S. government, basically have the power to interpret law as they see fit and enforce that view upon the nation. They can come up with excuses, you know, they always publish, like, this is my reason for voting and ruling so-and-so, but there is nothing stopping them doing whatever they wanted. Hypothetically, there's impeachment, but one, that almost never happens, and when it does, it doesn't even work. The U.S. Congress is incapable of impeaching even like a justice who is actively drunk and visibly suffering from dementia from the court. That is a thing that happened in our early country, and while he was impeached, he was not thrown off. He was acquitted. Even that low a bar cannot be overcome. That is how safe these motherfuckers are. Now, members of both the right and the left have a tendency to celebrate the court when it rules in their favor and deride it when it rules against them because no one actually cares. Everyone's just trying to win because, you know, it's politics. I certainly want to win. And in the year 2000, the court was composed of Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justices Stevens, O'Connor, Scalia, Kennedy, Scooter, Thomas, Ginsburg, and Breyer.
The case of Bush v. Gore presented the court with 2 main questions. Was the recount as it was conducted constitutional, and if not, what was the remedy? You see, Bush's team was arguing that the recount violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Essentially, given the lack of a statewide recount procedure, because it turns out like the Florida policies were just very vague, individual counties would be left to determine the ways in which they counted votes. This would be a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, which has that, like, you know, counting across the state has to be uniform. Gore's team argued that the statewide procedure was robust enough to be sufficiently uniform.
Because every county having a different counting procedure is how it's always worked and still to my knowledge, does work and whatnot, like, throughout the entire fucking country.
Yeah, it's
because
like,
we choose to do decentralized elections.
yeah, I think Ginsburg, I think, is the one who actually does bring that up in the dissent. Though on this question, the court actually came to a 7-2 decision that the recount, as it was being conducted, did violate the Equal Protection Clause. Basically, the differences would be too great, so unconstitutional. The second question then came into light. If the recount was unconstitutional, how should that issue be remedied?
Now, critical to this issue is a little-known element of U.S. electoral politics known as the safe harbor deadline, a deadline established in an 1887 act that had been criticized by some scholars as being, quote, almost unintelligible. Jay, have you tried to read this thing?
I have, and I agree.
In a shocking sequel to our last episode, the safe harbor concept was introduced following the, quote, corrupt bargain of 1877. The safe harbor was a deadline which, if states can submit their final results to Congress by, ensures that those results be treated as final. So if you get your result in by, say, I don't know, December 2nd or whatever, we will declare that as the final vote. The conservative judges of the court argued that any new recount procedure put in place to remedy the violation of the Equal Protection Clause would result in results that would come in after the December 12th safe harbor date. Basically, well, if we recount, then it would be too late. And the Florida state law and procedure should have been implemented as holding that date as final. The remedy would be to go with the existing vote count. Now, the more liberal judges, wonder why they're disagreeing, did not see the safe harbor date as an absolute deadline. In their view, the decision of the Florida Supreme Court to order a full recount should be upheld. Justices Souter and Breyer proposed that the remedy to the constitutionality question would be to give Florida judges the responsibility to oversee the process. So, in order to make sure the people of Florida get a fair shake, Florida judges are going to be able to oversee everything. Jay, real quick, do you want to talk about exactly why the Safe Harbor Act is so weird?
It's weird because it's one of these things where it's like Congress promises to, if your vote if a state reports the vote by the Safe Harbor deadline, then Congress more or less promises that vote is final. It's very vague onto whether, which
it is
part
final
of the state has to report that. I've seen some interpretations that, a state governor could overturn it, and some people say no. It's kind of very vague in regards to, is it the state legislature or the state governor? It's not a hard requirement, and actually Wisconsin did not meet the safe harbor deadline in 2020. So it's not it's a hard requirement. And there's no part of Florida state law saying that's a hard requirement that the count has to be done by the safe harbor deadline. It seems like it's more
the Constitution doesn't say anything about when the count should be finished.
Yeah.
If I'm correct.
Yeah, it's the Bush team had basically just presented some past Florida court judgments, which they argued set the precedent that the safe harbor deadline has been treated as an absolute deadline in the past. I've seen a lot of legal scholars argue that's not the case. That's a pretty incorrect interpretation of those court rulings. I've seen others say that other court rulings do establish it as a precedent, but those are ones that were not brought up by the Bush team. There's a lot of legal, confusion going on. But yeah, it ultimately comes down to the idea that you have the safe harbor deadline, which the Bush team is arguing is set in stone. But it's my interpretation, at least, the interpretation of the 4 dissenting judges and the interpretation of a lot of legal scholars after the fact is it was not really set in stone. And if we imagine that it should be set in stone, that sort of like leads to a weird thing where you could have like a blatantly wrong vote counting process. But, if you pass the safe harbor deadline, then you have to accept the results.
So ultimately, this question resulted in a 5-4 decision, so the thinnest of majorities. And that majority upheld the safe harbor deadline as final, and thus supported the existing vote count, which gave Bush a narrow win.
Yeah, and it should be noted that, the Supreme Court in their judgment, the type of judgment it was, gave Gore an opening. Gore wasn't quite out yet. Theoretically, Gore could take it back to the Florida Supreme Court and have the Supreme Court rule on whether the December 12th safe harbor deadline was actually final under Florida state law. If they ruled that it wasn't, then theoretically the case could then go back to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court could now say, well, the Florida state has interpreted state law, and state precedents to say that the safe harbor deadline is not absolute, so yes, the recount can go ahead. Gore, however, decided to concede the election to Bush on December 13th, 2000.
Like a bitch. And you could say that, Gore valued the American people having clarity that he didn't want to start a constitutional crisis. But a constitutional crisis had already fucking happened. The court has basically decided, because there are a majority of Republican operatives on the Supreme Court, that the Republicans are going to win the position. And that they, if I'm not wrong, specifically decided that this decision will be one that basically cannot be used as precedent for any other decision. Which, if you think you've got a fucking cast iron case, why the fuck would that... If you think you're doing good law, why would that be the case, right?
Yeah.
And this is essentially Scalia and his fucking fellow Republican lackeys outnumbering the Democrat lackeys and just directly null and voiding any pretension that this is a democratic, small d, democratic process. And that this unelected rules for life organization can just reach in and declare what the will of the people is. And also completely ignore said will. And in the face of, and because this is giving the game away, right? This, okay, so this is what this fundamentally is about, is institutions. And the belief that even though political people appoint the Supreme Court, once the Supreme Court exists, it is an unbiased institution. And this right here is basically definitive evidence that that is not true, right?
Yeah.
That the Supreme Court is hosted entirely by people whose first and last job is to do the will of their party bosses. This is breaking kayfabe, shall we say. This is directly stating that politics is war. The thing that we all know. We're all just in an endless war of one side of versus the other, each trying to score points, right?
Yes.
And, Gore and fucking Clinton had the opportunity to say that the American people were disserved by this, to give it another go, or to protest. And is it good that Clinton decided to not Andrew Jackson style say Rehnquist has made his decision, now let him enforce it? No, that would have been bad. But just flopping down on their, just turning over and showing your belly on this blatant act of bullshit is a joke.
Yeah, a lot of people say, like, okay, like Gore could have taken it back to Florida, had the Florida court rule on the safe harbor thing. Then Bush probably would have sued again, and it would have gone back up to the Supreme Court, and there would have been another 5-4 decision. And that's probably true. But at least, like, exhaust all opportunities and then say that, yeah, I've lost, I'm not going to be the president, but it's because of the Supreme Court. It's because of more or less 5 people saying that not every vote's going to be counted. As opposed to doing the whole concession thing of like,
to highlight the fact that, I don't know, and started a mass movement to try and get the Electoral College overthrown and polarize that as an issue to liberate Americans from it.
Yeah. And, again, like I mentioned it earlier about how like both the left and the right kind of like, everybody loves the Supreme Court when it sides with them. People on the right, far right Trump supporters,
institution.
Yeah, like hated the Supreme Court for siding against a lot of like the Trump campaign's kind of batshit insane cases after 2020.
Muslim ban and whatnot.
Yeah. And what was I saying earlier? But like, that thing kind of keeps the Supreme Court entrenched, where like everybody's just trying to get their judges on it and get control over it, rather than questioning, like, why does judicial review exist as a concept? Or why do we only have 9 members? And like, even though it was originally 6.
Why are they appointed for life?
Yeah, like,
why is there no mechanism besides impeachment to check them? The Supreme Court, like, my understanding is that, like, right now, like, for instance, Justice Roberts, the guy in charge, like, his basically sole mission in life is to make the court as boring as possible so people don't pay attention to it. Because it's basically openly understood that if people knew how the Supreme Court operated, they would want it changed, and the Supreme Court obviously wants itself to be fucked with as little as possible. Now, in a few months, the Supreme Court is almost certainly going to rule on some cases that are essentially going to enslave the bodies of over half of America and roll back the clock 6 decades on American freedom. And, will be interesting to see what the American people think about that, and whether or not there will be riots in the streets. But, this is no one is competent, and there are many people who are not competent, and I really think that a huge incompetence here is on the American people. This shit was fucking accepted. That, like, everyone just rolled over and was like, sure, whatever. Yeah. And I think a huge part of that has to do with the fact that ultimately a lot of people didn't fully fucking care about this. A lot of the American people, a lot of people loved Gore, a lot of people loved Bush, but then there was probably a majority who was like, it'd be fine.
Yeah. Since 2000, there have been several attempts by academics to predict what the results would have been if the recount had taken place. There was a big project by the University of Chicago which came to the conclusion that a full recount would have given Gore a narrow victory over Bush, though a partial recount more limited in the ballots subject to counting would have probably still resulted in a Bush victory. This project also highlighted the fact that the ballots in predominantly black counties were rejected at a far higher rate than those in white counties because,
Funny that.
Yeah, that's just what happens. I wonder why. We'll never know for sure what the results of a full recount would have been, but Gore's chances of winning in such a scenario would have probably been higher than Bush's. That seems to be the academic consensus.
And it's also worth noting that if, in spreading the blame around, that if all of these dumbass Florida counties were better at counting their votes, we would never been in the situation to begin with.
Yeah.
If like the punch card system was better. Apparently there were also some ballots that were just like very confusingly constructed, that if the counting was more efficient.
Oh yeah, like I didn't mention it earlier, but like with these punch card ballots, there was also like a layout of the ballot which just like made it kind of unclear. Like, it's not unclear who you are voting for, but it was laid out in a way where you could see why somebody would easily make a mistake and vote for the wrong person. And, it's hard to say that really, like, tipped things either way, because it probably would have affected both candidates equally. But, like, yeah, it's not the fact that, like, such an important thing is just, like, subject to such stupid human error is kind of, it's something that should not happen.
Yeah, we like to think of ourselves as being, we are a country ruled by laws, not men. And it's like, no, a ton of human history and events and who rules most important country in the world just comes down to how good, like 7 people are at counting.
Yeah.
And, you might wonder why the Democrats and the Democratic Party and all their loyal followers do not riot in the streets at this outcome, why you don't see marches, why you don't see an attempt to overtake the Capitol. And I think a lot of that goes into what the Democratic Party is. We said before that in this period, the parties were functionally very similar as the Democrats chased the Republicans to the right. And at this point, you'd be hard-pressed to articulate what the Democratic Party stood for. The election of 2000 is the cipher to understand all of the woes of the current Democratic Party. If you're ever puzzled by the actions of Obama or Biden, Kerry or Harris, look to the actions of Gore and Clinton. On the cusp of victory, in the face of cartoonish lies, the leaders of the largest political party in America decided to lay down power at the foot of America's institutions, to sacrifice themselves to the will of the Supreme Court, to the will of some shoddy, dumbass counting by some hicks in Florida. The Republicans have always accused the Democrats of being godless, but that insult rings hollow. The Democratic Party is, at its core, a sad, delusional cult dedicated to the worship of government institutions. And whenever any issue comes up, be it civil rights or national security or privacy or healthcare or whether or not people are going to fucking starve to death, whether or not we're going to go to war, they will choose the institutions over us every single time, because no one is competent. Jay, what are our plugs? What should the people do?
Well, you can follow the podcast on Twitter at not_competent. You can also reach out to us on email at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. You make sure to rate, subscribe to our podcast, do whatever you have to do on YouTube.
Hey! Yo, Apple, iTunes.
Yeah.
I want to get that number of reviews up to 10. Let's fucking do it, people. Steal your friends' iPhones and review the podcast. Do it. Commit crimes. It's fine. Crimes are great.
Yep.
As we've just laid out in this podcast, people in power do crimes. It's fine. They're setting a good example for you.
Yeah. Beyond that, actually, I think that wraps it up about, unless we have anything else.
Our music is done by the legendary Sam Bryce. And yeah, I think that'll be that. Jay, say bye.
Farewell.
And y'all be good.